talk about neuroplasticity now. Now, neuroplasticity is a relatively new science, meaning that in the past 20 years or so, it's become something that science is now beginning to wrap their minds around. But in the past, the brain was seen as something that was immovable. It was just the way it was, and that was it. But neuroplasticity means, the definition is the brain's ability to reorganize by forming new neural pathways. So it's the brain's ability to reorganize by forming new neural pathways. So the metaphor that most scientists used to think of the brain was that it was like a machine, and certain parts did certain things. There's the speech part, the walking part, whatever. Just like that phrenology head out in the lobby, they believed in a similar concept, that certain aspects, parts of the brain did certain things. And now they believe that the machine metaphor is outdated and no longer true, because they have now come to study how neurons behave, and they're noticing many interesting things caused first by seeing certain behaviors or certain recoveries from certain types of illnesses that defied the usual mindset of the machine part, where it's one part sticks to one thing. So they now know that nerve endings grow through something called axonal, A-X-O-N-A-L, sprouting. So these axonal nerve cells actually continue to sprout and get longer and longer. So in the past, when one hemisphere of the brain was damaged, then the assumption was that that was it. That part of the brain would never work again, and that person lost all the functions that were in that hemisphere of the brain. But now they have seen cases where the other hemisphere will take up some of the tasks that were not originally in its domain. So they started to see this in many different cases, which is what started them thinking that, maybe this is a little different than we once thought. So back in the 1800s, which is where a lot of the old information comes from, and in fact somebody that you've heard about here, Broca's area, was a surgeon named Paul Broca, B-R-O-C-A, and the region of the brain was named for him. He discovered that area of the brain when someone had a stroke, and they noticed that the part of the brain that this person had the stroke in was the part that covered speech, because now the person could no longer speak. So they associated those two things because back then, whatever happened was all they knew. They didn't have fancy kinds of brain scans. They didn't know how to look at those parts of the brain, and so all they could do was go with what they could see. So that was 1861 that this French surgeon discovered that region of the brain. And it is a part that's vital for speech. But it's not the only part that can do that. It's just the part that generally does that from the start. It also, as we know here, and we have used this idea, it's involved in language comprehension, motor activities associated with hand movements. So when we talk about memory, remembering language, comprehension associated with hand movement, we're talking about writing notes and remembering them better, because we've learned that that is the case, especially in the learning and integration phase of gaining information. So that was Broca's area, and it is, in fact, the area where all those things are stored. People in the 19th century just saw it, and that's the way it was. So their belief system was such that the brain was fixed and unregenerative. Once it was formed, that was it. If there was an accident and a part was damaged, they just lost those parts of their mind. They just could no longer function in certain ways. So in recent years, 2002 is one of the most interesting books on this subject. It's called The Psychobiology of Gene Expression, Neuroscience and Neurogenesis in Hypnosis and the Healing Arts. A long title, I'll repeat. Psychobiology of Gene Expression, Neuroscience and Neurogenesis in Hypnosis and the Healing Arts. So this book is on Amazon. It was written by a PhD named Ernest Rossi in 2002. Fairly recent book. It is good. I've got it. And in this book, he describes how the brain enters into these neuroplastic states where now things can shift inside the brain, not just in the mind, but the actual structure of the brain changes. And he says that all begins oftentimes in a state of trance. In order to get somebody to be able to change their own brain structure, you need a trance-like state. Meditative state also could work. In his book, he talks about turning on certain genes. Certain genes are turned on through behavior. Learning is one of those behaviors that turns on certain genes, and that's where they can then use that fact, learning new things, to keep the brain growing. When you learn something new or relearn something like language and speech, when you've lost that capacity. So brain plasticity is initiated in that way. They also know that the mirror neurons demonstrate how action and cognition, action and thought, are linked. So if you've ever heard the saying, monkey see, monkey do, that's a demonstration of mirror neurons in action. Because when they study monkeys and they have one monkey who does something new that the other monkeys didn't know how to do, maybe they peel a banana in a different way or use a tool to open something like a stick, the other monkeys will see that and they will start imitating it, because all creatures have mirror neurons, meaning they mirror what other people or creatures of their ilk will do. So that's part of the brain plasticity case as well, all the things that go into it. So it's learning just like monkeys do. In humans, you see the concept of mirror neurons at work when you're walking down the hall and somebody smiles at you and you smile back at them. You just naturally, people reflect things back. They mirror other people's behavior if they want to be in rapport with that person. Because if somebody smiles at you and you go like, they're not going to feel in rapport with you. So it's that mirroring action that creates a lot of rapport between people. Being more like someone else makes them feel that they like you more. New activities also are part of this brain plasticity, because new activities stimulate the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is part of the brain that deals a lot with memory. When people have loss of oxygen to the brain, they will also oftentimes have short-term memory loss in the hippocampus. Through the study of all of this, brain plasticity and hypnosis, this fellow that wrote that book talks about how, through his studies, he's seen how memories that you can access that have not been touched for maybe 20 years. In the case of where we go back in time and find someone's first time, the root cause of a trauma, we may unlock a memory. And they're finding now that unlocked memory remains malleable or changeable for about 6 hours. So if you can unlock it and reframe it in some way for that person, that's why. I mean, this is so cool because it explains why people's thoughts about something in their past actually change. Because you've unlocked it, you've shifted it in some way that it's no longer this big negative thing, and that can help them to move past it. So you're actually helping people to change their structure of their mind, which is really kind of cool. Jim's thinking. So then he talks about how sleep is another part of it, sleep and REM. Whether the REM comes in the form of sleep or when you have them in deep states of hypnosis, right, the theta brainwaves, we can get people into that same state, which, as we know, is a place where people can change more quickly because it's a place where people learn. The mind learns during that phase. In sleep, as I think Bob was talking a couple of weeks ago, we can process through all this information in a couple minutes that took maybe 8 hours to run through if you were conscious. So it's the part of the mind that relearns things quickly or learns new things quickly. Sleep, just as theta in hypnosis, tend to have the same impact on learning. So when you want to change something with a person, you're not just telling them, oh, erase that. It's more about helping them to learn a different way of thinking and feeling about something, right? We're helping them learn, and that's what REM sleep and theta brain waves help us do so well. Things learn and are integrated. I don't know, but I remember a case where way back when I was doing the recruiting, and I took this job at this big search firm in San Francisco, and they had great training. I mean, it's a lot of information though. So we'd sit there 8 hours a day going all these different ways of saying things to help people make a decision, working through different ways to close when you're talking on the phone to people who, make a couple $100,000 a year. So they're not easy people to manipulate in any way. You have to do it logically, using all sorts of different distinctions. And so I remember back when I was going through all that rapid learning, we only had 5 days to absorb tons of information, I would have these dreams, really vivid dreams, right? And those are the kind that are taking place in REM, where I would just go through all this stuff. And it's like through kind of rehearsals of doing it, calling people, talking on the phone, closing, this and that, and all these different details were just swirling around in your head. Or when you learn a new tennis swing or something, that's the same kind of thing, that you would see it, you would dream it, or you would integrate it through that deep level of theta brain waves here in our office. So those different ways make you learn faster. And all of these different kinds of tools that Rossi provides a model then, a model for us to be able to use hypnosis with a scientific viewpoint. They can actually explain to people how this shifts how their brain takes in information, how you can change it, and how that can become permanent. Because we want to make permanent behavioral change, right? We don't want it to just be here because somebody thinks different temporarily. That's great. That's something that happens in the first few sessions. But the more we reinforce it, the more we change some of those old memories or shift them in some way, reframe them, the more we have them take action in the new way, the more we have them repeatedly use their recordings and fall into deep sleep and run through it. All of these things are what makes it become permanent, because they are literally changing their mind. Other major players in the field of neuroplasticity, along with Rossi, Norman Doidge, D-O-I-D-G-E-S. He's written 2 books. One's called The Brain That Changes Itself, and this was written in 2007. The other one's called The Brain's Way of Healing, and that's from this last year, 2015. And now, all of these people tend to be pretty brilliant, the thinkers that are writing these books. This fellow started out as a philosopher, trained in philosophy, and he decided to become a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, and a scientist on top of his philosophical degrees, and the fact that he was given a major award in poetry as well. So he wrote a poem that was lauded, gained him some kind of award. So a brilliant fellow, and he talks about the same things that we just went over. And in his case, he has a lot of, because he's kind of the go-to guy, he's the most famous of the people that talk about neuroplasticity. He gets a lot of people calling him and telling them their stories. So he's getting examples of how this has worked over time. Because it's really hard to know something's shifting neuroplastically, I guess that's the way you would say that, in the moment, because unless you can see it on some kind of brain scan. So people are shifting how they think, either through hypnosis or on their own, and that's what's creating these changes. So he's taken from these stories. Another fellow called Eric Kandel, K-A-N-D-E-L, who's a scientist, he was the one that discovered that learning created the connections and cause the nerve cells to grow. So he actually won a Nobel Prize for that, Nobel Prize in medicine. He's the one that discovered that those neurons actually grow and create new connections. This is how someone who's lost their ability to use Broca's area because they were in a bad accident, it's been destroyed, can now speak, coming from another part of the brain. He also was the one that showed that learning switches on certain genes that change that neural structure. So these three gentlemen are the big players in neuroplasticity at the moment. Other examples of this, one of them is something we've already talked about, and that is the Tibetan monks. Whenever they need a go-to work on brain scans of higher level thought, they use the Tibetan monks. Number one, they're all bald, so it's much easier to put the sensors on their heads, right? So this guy, this particular monk, well, I just thought of that. It's like, they're all bald. It's perfect. They put 246 sensors on this guy's bald head. And that made it so much easier because it's plastered. If you see a picture of it, it's all white because all the little sensors are so close together. And this one particular fellow named Matthew Ricard is a 66-year-old Tibetan monk, and he's also a geneticist. And they've done numerous studies on this fellow's brain waves because he's one of the ones that they first noticed the gamma waves in. Remember how we talked about those? That it's elevated brain waves. And, if you're meditating for thousands of hours, it's not a stretch to think that that would change the structure of the brain. And what they've noticed, as I've talked about before, is a large prefrontal cortex in these people. It's just grown and grown and grown, which makes them then much better with all kinds of consciousness, the ability to get into deep states of meditation. It helps them with attention, learning, and memory. Their brains just function so well from, one fellow said they estimated that he had spent 30,000 hours in meditation, along with being a geneticist, so he had to go to school too, in his off hours. This is long term, starting in childhood up till he's 66. So this gentleman demonstrates off the chart gamma waves. It doesn't even fit in the waves that we've seen, I think it was 40 to 100, so his go beyond that. Major excessive activity in the prefrontal cortex. And so they say this gives him an inordinate capacity for happiness. Because when you grow your prefrontal cortex, people just feel good. So he's an incredibly happy fellow, which is why all those monks are always sitting around giggling. Have you ever noticed? They're like, they're happy people. They aren't bothered by negativity because their mind is so focused in a particular way that the negativity is just, it's like they become Teflon monks. It just slides right off them. And they noticed, of course, the monks with the most meditative experience showed the most significant brain function changes. 20 minutes a day for 3 weeks actually made some changes in regular people's abilities as well. So they demonstrated some change in their prefrontal cortex from just 3 weeks of 20 minutes a day of meditation. So regular average person. So with the prefrontal cortex, though, in these fellows, they have more gray matter. They actually have more thinking matter in their brains than the average person. Some other examples of this that were in this one gentleman's book on healing with the brain were examples of using neuroplasticity. So these were examples where the person did it themselves through some kind of guidance from a hypnotist or just desire. So one gentleman had lost his vision, and it was because the part of his mind that held that part, the visual part, was no longer functioning properly. And he was able to, and I can't remember the disease, I'll have to look it up, but he was able to regain some visual. Not as good as an average person, but he could see like black and white images, he could see the outlines of things that he couldn't see anything before, complete blindness. Another example that we're going to talk about more when we get to pain mitigation is spinal cord injuries. people that have spinal cord injuries can be in horrific pain, obviously. You're closer to the place where all the pain comes from in the first place, so it just keeps going back and forth from the spinal cord into the brain, and the pain centers there, and it's incredible bad pain and very hard to alleviate. But this gentleman used hypnotic techniques, focusing every day for hours on only feeling anything but the pain. Anything but the pain. He just kept doing it. I think he was a doctor too. But what they found is that somebody did an interview with this Norman Deutsch fellow, and they said, well, yeah, but this doesn't sound like the average person could do this. Probably not unguided. Most of the people that did it on their own from these stories were pretty intelligent people. Many of them were doctors, and they were strongly driven as well. So what you need for the perfect combination of someone to do this on their own is someone who's very open to it. They don't have to believe it necessarily, but they have to let go of disbelief so that they can just get past the idea that they somehow can change their brain. That's a hard belief to come up with, but just letting go and being open so that they're not holding on to negative beliefs will help. And the other part they said that showed the ability to make these kinds of changes is a person who is very determined and is willing not to just do 20 minutes a day. That's not going to do it. Just like when we talk about cancer and how people use images to reduce the size of tumors, the protocol for that is 45 minutes twice a day. So it's not just sit down and for a few minutes. This is powerful, internal, visual work that either needs to be guided by someone who's highly motivated or through a hypnotist or someone else who knows these techniques. These are the people that are doing this. This is really cutting-edge work that is not yet compensated by insurance. So you're not going to get a lot of psychologists doing it. So it really helps, I think, people to understand how we can help them to change their minds, because it is all connected. Everything's connected here. And this idea that somehow hypnosis changes things permanently is something that we've noticed over years and years of working with people, and this explains why. And that is so cool. I'm still reading that book by Ernest Rossi. It's not kind of a quick read. But I'm working on it. When I need to fall asleep quickly, but it's really interesting. Yeah, exactly. So this neuroplasticity helps people then, using hypnosis, to change memories. It helps us to help people change behaviors more quickly and make the changes permanent. It helps us to help people to heal their body and or their brain in case of chronic pain and things of that sort without using drugs.